The Jehovah's Witnesses are a religious group, and they were born out of the same 19th century restorationist movement that brought you the LDS, the Church of Christ, the Adventists, and so on. As of 2024, they have roughly 9 million active publishers, and they have distributed over 41 million copies of their print magazine called the Watchtower. They also contribute to a lot of other crazy stats, such as a 9% higher education rate amongst members, one of the lowest household median incomes amongst religious groups, and their headquarters in Australia actually covered up over 1,800 cases of child abuse from the year 1950 to 2015. Now, I could go into even crazier stats, such as according to this study, they even have increased rates of schizophrenia. But here's what you really need to know. Every year that the Watchtower exists, more lives are ruined. People are abused and then covered up. Families are ripped apart through their very staunch excommunication rules, and not to mention that people are just fear-mongered and manipulated through their deeply perverted eschatology. Not to mention that they also stand in complete contradiction to the gospel, and it's something that more Christians need to be prepared and equipped to confront when given the opportunity. In this video, my hope is to just give you an introduction to the Jehovah's Witnesses and help you just get your foot in the door when it comes to dealing with them. In this video, I'm going to cover a bit of their history, how they operate today, best tips and practices when dealing with them, and of course, how to actually refute them and argue their points using their own Bible. So, I know you're probably not super interested in a history lesson, but I promise this is important. You have to understand where they come from to understand how they work today. The man originally responsible for them is a guy named Charles Taze Russell. Now, Russell was raised Presbyterian before moving on to Congregationalism when he got a little bit older, but he could never find a home within either of those traditions. He, in particular, had a problem with the doctrine of predestination and the doctrine of an eternal hell. So when he got a bit older, he finally found a home within Adventism, which is also another 19th century restorationist movement cult. By 1870, at the age of 18, he formed a small Bible study group, and in this Bible study group, it was comprised of members who also had this contradictory view to Christianity that Charles also had. Those contradictory views include rejection of the Trinity, belief that Jesus is Michael the Archangel and is God's first creation, belief that the Holy Spirit is a force and not a person, rejection of an eternal hell, rejection of the bodily resurrection of Christ, and of course, an intense obsession with the return of Christ. By 1876, he teamed up with a guy named Nelson Barber, who was a former Millerite. Now, Nelson also had some pretty out there ideas, including the fact that he believed that Jesus had returned spiritually in 1874. So Barber and Russell together formed a new prophecy that included the spiritual return of Jesus in 1874, and then in 1878, a rapture of believers would happen, and then in 1914, the end of the Gentile times would come. But, of course, this prophecy did not come true, and when it did not come true, they split ways. And then after that, Russell went on to found the Watchtower Society. He then just kind of reworked the prophecy so that 1874 still marked the invisible return of Christ, and 1914 would still mark the end of the Gentile times. Now, this is where things get really interesting. So in 1916, 2 years after his prediction, Charles actually dies. And when he dies, his lawyer takes over the Watchtower Society. Now, really quickly, I'm not going to get into it in this video, but there's actually a really funny court transcript on Google that you really need to look up. So his lawyer that took over for him is the same lawyer that represented Charles at a court case where he was countersued when he sued someone else for defamation. And in that court case, it was proven that Charles actually couldn't speak Greek, even though he heavily implied in his writings. So go look it up for yourself. I'm not going to get into this video, but it's just hilarious. Anyway, this lawyer was named Joseph Rutherford. Rutherford is the guy who actually implemented a lot of the interesting things that you see today about the Jehovah's Witnesses, including the bannings of celebrating birthdays, you can't celebrate Christmas, and he also is the one who banned blood transfusions. He also said that Jesus was crucified on a torture stake and not a cross, but I digress. What's really important is that he also is the person who instituted this whole idea of Jehovah's Witnesses. So you see, when Charles died, the group kind of schismed into a few different groups, but Rutherford took over the Watchtower Society and took whatever followers were still loyal to the Watchtower. So in 1931, he actually implemented the name change to Jehovah's Witnesses, and he also implemented this whole idea that Jehovah is the only true name of God. So Rutherford is probably most important when it comes to the formation of the religious group that we see today, but I started with Charles because I needed you to see just the amount of lunacy this whole thing is built off of. I mean, it's just false prophecy after false prophecy after false prophecy. Now, speaking of prophecy really quick, Rutherford actually reworked the original prophecy again after Charles did a second time when the first one didn't come true. Rutherford then moved the invisible return of Christ to 1914 and then made a separate prediction where the end times would come later on.
1914 became the date of both Christ's invisible return and the beginning of the time of the end. This date was put forth not as theory or interpretation, but as hard, indisputable fact.
He also made a lot of other predictions, which we'll get to later in this video. Today, they've held on to most of what Rutherford implemented and have innovated in a few ways. Their members are called publishers, and you're considered an active publisher if you are partaking in their heavy door-to-door evangelism and you're reporting your hours to the Watchtower. Now, if you dedicate a certain amount of hours a month to publishing, then you can then be considered a pioneer. Their churches are called kingdom halls, and they're very bare and empty as they don't want to be associated with any sort of denomination of Christianity, and they also don't want to be associated with any sort of man-made ritual. Lastly, all of this is watched over by the governing body, which is their central authority figure within the Watchtower. This governing body was instituted in 1971 after they had a presidential model for a while, and the governing body is essentially God on earth for the Jehovah's Witnesses. Basically, everything that they say goes. The governing body claims that they are the faithful and discreet slave that you see in the book of Matthew, and they claim that God speaks through them to dispense spiritual food to his followers.
Since Jehovah God and Jesus Christ completely trust the faithful and discreet slave, should we not do the same?
But with all of this nonsense that they claim, they also, in the same breath, will say that they are not infallible and they are capable of making mistakes. Very convenient, I know. You can actually see this in action as they just recently reversed a very long-time stance on higher education. For years, members were discouraged from pursuing any sort of higher education because they believed that secular universities were pagan and of the devil, and members were better off serving the organization instead. That's why you have that 9% higher education rate that I mentioned earlier in the video. Now, the last and one of the most important things to know about them is that just like all these other groups, they also have their own book. Except this book doesn't come in the form of golden plates from a 19th century con man, or it doesn't come from revelations from a 7th century sexual deviant. Instead, they actually use our own scriptures, just in a very butchered, horribly translated version of the Bible called the New World Translation. This translation right here was commissioned by the Watchtower to the New World Translation Bible Committee. Great name, I know. Now, this committee wished to remain anonymous to better glorify God, but turns out that committee was comprised of a bunch of white dudes who actually couldn't even speak Hebrew or Greek. Except for one of them, a guy named Frederick Franz. And Frederick apparently had 2 years of higher education before eventually dropping out of the program. All of the other people, according to my research, couldn't even pass a literacy test with Greek or Hebrew and had no formal education in any sort of textual or linguistic practice. Now, we could talk about this translation and the people who made it all day, but here are the main things you need to know. No textual scholar worth their salt today believes that this is a good translation of the original Hebrew and Greek. It is quite obviously very biased towards their own theology and makes a lot of very interesting decisions, to say the least. Take John 1:1 for example. In any standard normal English translation of the Bible, it will read something along the lines of, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." But the New World Translation reads as, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God," with a lowercase g, of course. Now, they have a justification for this, and it includes something along the lines of the original Greek lacks a definite article, which leads them to this translation, but again, no textual scholar actually agrees with them, when in reality, they're just trying to get away from any sort of biblical mention of Jesus being God or Jesus being an uncreated being. And of course, they do this in other areas of the Bible, which I'll get to in just a minute. When it comes to actually witnessing to the witnesses, there's a few things that we need to keep in mind, and the first one being that we need to lead with empathy. Now, I know, again, you're probably just itching to debate them and refute them when they come to your door, but I promise this is really important. You have to understand that these people are legitimately brainwashed in a way. They are basically told what to do with their lives by the governing body. This includes forbidding them from partaking in any sort of secular media or content that's outside of the Watchtower approved materials. So I highly doubt that a JW will actually ever even see this video. But if you are watching, then I highly, highly, highly implore you to do any sort of independent research that's outside of the Watchtower. Because speaking of research, members will usually say, "Oh, we're encouraged to do our own research. We can go research anything that we want to do." But they'll conveniently leave out the part where the Watchtower says they can, but only with Watchtower approved materials. They're also highly trained in their scriptures and are trained to have answers to most rebuttals to their arguments. So Do not try to get into any sort of verse-off with them, as they will almost certainly know their Bible better than you do. Lastly, they're also encouraged to lie in the name of theocratic warfare if the circumstances arise. So you have to understand that you're not just dealing with your hard-headed Baptist grandma. You're dealing with people who are truly born, bred, and made to spread Watchtower propaganda. So you cannot get frustrated and lose your cool or anything of the sort when dealing with them, as it's truly not their fault. You have to approach them with empathy and love, but also firmness. Take control of the conversation and ask leading questions, and then make them answer you. Do not let them get you in this weird verse-off game where they're hopping all over the Bible, and then you're just all confused and can't keep up, and then there's no way to have any sort of fruitful discussion with them. They typically use this tactic to weasel their way out of the conversation when they know things aren't going their way. And then after that, they'll typically just send an elder to come talk to you, or they'll just put you on the do not visit list. Stick to one verse at a time and one argument at a time, and make them answer you. Secondly, and this is one of the most important things you have to know, is that you have to use their materials. I call this the St. Innocent approach. St. Innocent was an Eastern Orthodox saint who evangelized a lot of the remote parts of Alaska. He did this by going to them and living amongst them and developing alphabets and transcribing a lot of his materials into their languages. He met them where they were instead of making them meet him where he is. And we have to take the same approach. So like I said earlier, everything outside of the Watchtower is considered pagan and of the devil by them. So they only believe that their translation is the right translation, and they only believe that their materials are free of any sort of pagan influence. This also means calling God the Father Jehovah, as again, they believe that Jehovah is the only true name for God. So if they hear you say something other than the name Jehovah, or they see you quoting from a different Bible than the New World Translation, they're just going to mentally write you off immediately because they believe that you have pagan influence. So it's of the utmost importance that you make sure that you're meeting them where they are. Use the name Jehovah and use their Bible and their translation. Also, it definitely helps that if you're going to use any sort of supplementary materials, they also have to be Watchtower approved materials, or again, they're just going to write you off. Lastly, you have to set expectations with yourself. It's very easy when you're first starting to get into apologetics that you come in very naive and you believe that you're going to have this magical confrontation because you've been studying so much, and you're going to have this magical confrontation with them where you're going to refute all their points and they're going to convert to Christianity and they'll come to church with you and everything will be good. You got to get the savior complex out of your head. How this is actually going to go is that you're going to confront them and you're going to try to get them into some sort of debate. You might be able to make some good points, but they'll just use their theocratic warfare if they feel like things aren't going their way, and they'll find a way to weasel their way out of the conversation, and then they'll either send an elder to come talk to you, or again, they'll just put you on the do not visit list. But they are, again, highly trained and capable of making conversations go however they want to, and they're very easy of finding their way out of conversation if they need to. So it is not your job to convert them on the spot, because it's just not going to happen. What is your job is to walk up to the Texas-sized dam that is the Watchtower brainwashing and try to put as big of a crack in it as possible. Even if it's the smallest of cracks, under pressure, over time, that crack will grow, and hopefully eventually the dam will give way. It's your job to just plant the tiniest seeds of doubt, and then hopefully over time, with continued efforts and prayer, that seed will grow and they will eventually come to the true faith. You can see this anecdotally if you read any sort of ex-Jehovah Witness conversion story. A lot of the times they'll say somebody said something or they read something and some sort of seed of doubt was planted in their head. And over time, that doubt just grew and grew until they couldn't take it anymore. And then they did some sort of independent research outside of the Watchtower and realized that their religion and cult is wrong. So it's your job to only plant that seed of doubt. We're not trying to convert them on the spot, as it's just typically 99.9% of the time just not going to happen. Okay, so the part you've all been waiting for. What are the best arguments to use against them? There's plenty of topics within their theology that you can attack, but just to give you a brief recap of what I mentioned earlier, they believe that Jesus is Michael the Archangel and a created being, so that means they also reject the Trinity. They also reject the bodily resurrection of Christ as well and believe that he only resurrected spiritually. They also believe things like the Holy Spirit is just a force and not a person, and of course they again believe that Jehovah is the only true name of God. They also have some other interesting quirks in there, but those are kind of the high main points that you need to know. So there's lots of different arguments that you can bring to the table, but one of the easiest and best ones to learn when you're starting is actually an argument that I got from Sam Shamoon. I'll talk about Sam and a few other resources here in a little bit. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to want to use the title, the first and the last from the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 44:6, 48:12, and 41:4, Jehovah uses the title, the first and the last, for himself. So Isaiah 44:6 in the New World Translation reads, This is what Jehovah says, the King of Israel and his repurchaser, Jehovah of armies. I am the first and I am the last. There is no God but me. You can also see what 48:12 and 41:4 says here on the screen. But essentially, again, we're just using the title, the first and the last. So what you want to do is that you want to establish with them that first and the last references Jehovah. You can see there in the scriptures that Jehovah himself calls himself the first and the last. So just make sure that you are confirming that with them, that they know that the first and the last pertains to Jehovah. After you've done that, you're then going to flip to Revelation 1:17 and 18. Again in the New World Translation. Revelation 1:17 and 18 reads, When I saw him, I fell as dead at his feet, and he laid his right hand on me and said, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, and the living one. And I became dead, but look, I am living forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of the grave. So obviously this is Jesus claiming to be God by way of claiming the title, the first and the last. But they don't know that yet. So what you're going to do is that you're going to read verse 17 and then stop. And then you're going to ask him one more time that, does the title, the first and the last, pertain to Jehovah? And when they say yes, you'll say, well, when did Jehovah die? And then they're like, wait, what? No, Jehovah can't die. Then you'll hit them with verse 18 to show clearly that Jesus also claims to be God. Usually when you give them this argument, this is when they'll typically give you the theocratic warfare nonsense and try to weasel their way out of the conversation, but make them answer you. Hold them to this verse. They also, again, cannot use any sort of corrupted translation argument against you, as again, we're quoting from the New World Translation. So after I give them this argument, this is typically when I like to bring this bad boy out. This is the Kingdom Interlinear translation of the Greek. Now, Mike Winger actually put me onto this, and it's kind of hard to find nowadays, but I found a copy on eBay, and it'll definitely run you a little bit of money, but if you're serious about apologetics, especially towards Jehovah's Witnesses in any way, I definitely think this is worth the pickup. So what this is a Greek interlinear translation of the New Testament, and this was produced by the Watchtower from, I believe, the late 60s into the 80s. Now, I have no idea what they were smoking when they made this, as this is one of the most self-damning things the Watchtower has ever made, outside of their false prophecies, of course. So if you're unfamiliar with the Greek interlinear translation, then you'll see here that on the one side we have the original Greek words, and then underneath it you have the original word-for-word translation of the Greek. And then over here to the right you have the English translation that's pieced together through the word-for-word interlinear. Now the reason why that I love this book so much when it comes to witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses is because through their own Watchtower approved materials, you can show them just how bad faith the New World Translation actually is. One of the best examples of this is Colossians 1:16 and 17. In a normal translation, this verse reads, For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. But the New World Translation reads as, Because by means of him all other things were created in the heavens and on earth, the things visible and the things invisible, whether they are thrones or lordships or governments or authorities. All other things have been created through him and for him. Also, he is before all other things, and by means of him all other things were made to exist. But there's a huge problem here. If you take a look at the interlinear, you will see that other is nowhere found anywhere in the original Greek. And then if you look over at their translation that they put to the right, you will see that they put brackets around the word other to show that they added that word in the translation. Again, this is to get away from any sort of reference to Jesus being God or an uncreated being or anything of the sort. So in their own Watchtower approved materials, you can show them that, hey, this is an awful translation and it's heavily biased towards your own theology. Ask them the implications of what that verse would mean if you remove the word other, just like all the other English Bibles actually have. Now, this can come up a different way, as the witnesses actually love to bring up Colossians 1:18 to show that Jesus is a created being. So while you're there showing them those two verses and showing how bad their translation is, if they want to bring up the 18 argument, you can just flip over to Psalms 89:27, and we can see here that firstborn is not necessarily a indication of chronological birth order, and instead a title, because by their logic, if it is an indication of chronological birth order, then Jehovah is a liar, because we all know that David was not the firstborn of his family. Now after this, after you have them questioning their own translation, this is when I typically like to shift from the translation to the people who made it. I like to bring up the passages in Deuteronomy that show what we should measure prophets by and how we can tell if they are a false prophet or a true prophet. From here, you can bring up the numerous false prophecies that the Watchtower has made over the years. In 1918, they predicted that God would destroy churches churches and millions of their members. In 1925, they actually predicted that the resurrection of the Old Testament patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would resurrect and live again amongst us. Rutherford actually built a mansion in San Diego to house them for this resurrection. Also in 1941, during a Jehovah's Witness convention, young people were told that Armageddon was so close that there was no point in pursuing careers, marriages, or families. And then one of the most famous ones was that they heavily implied through multiple publications that 1975 would actually mark the 6,000 year mark of human existence and that the world would most likely end there. Many witnesses sold homes, delayed children, or left their jobs expecting Armageddon. And one of the more recent ones was in the early 2000s, the Watchtower taught for decades that the generation that was alive for 1914 would not pass away before Christ returned. Of course, when those people started to die out, they reworked the prophecy in 2010 and said that this now current generation was an overlapping generation. And then lastly, you can just touch on some of the life-controlling aspects of the governing body and ask them how they feel about how for years they were basically forbidden from pursuing higher education, and then out of nowhere, they are now allowed to. And not only that, when the governing body reversed their decision or stance on this issue, they actually didn't even offer an apology and said that no apology was actually needed.
With this update, we'd like to clarify our understanding. While there are dangers involved in pursuing certain forms of education, basically, whether to obtain additional education or not is a matter for personal decision.
Now, for resources and people to look at, I think one of the best ones is actually the Watchtower themselves. They produce a ton of publications and different materials, and you can find a lot of this either on their website or on their app. Actually, on their app, you can actually gain access to the New World Translation for free, which is really nice. This also allows you to kind of see what they are currently teaching and believing, and so you can kind of get in the mind of where a witness may be at today. Again, I'll plug this Interlinear, as I truly think it's one of the best ways to show them just how bad their translation is. Someone that you need to know is a guy named Ray Franz. Now, Ray was a former member of the governing body before he got disfellowshipped or excommunicated. After being excommunicated, he actually wrote 2 books about the Jehovah's Witnesses and his experiences being a member of the governing body, and I think both of those books are definitely worth the read. Speaking of excommunicated members, there's an excommunicated member that runs a website called JW Facts, and on that website they do a really good job of cataloging all of the misfortunes and terrible things that go along with the Watchtower. Lastly, I would also definitely familiarize yourself with all of their failed prophecies in the 1900s going into the 2000s. As far as other people are concerned, there are definitely a few out there on YouTube or on online blogs or have written books who I think are really good resources when it comes to witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm not advocating for everything that these people teach, so if you don't like them, don't come for me, but I do think that there are good resources for specifically apologetics against Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the first being Dr. James White. He's been debating and having talks about them for years, and you can find a lot of this on YouTube. Another guy is a guy named Sam Shamoon, who I mentioned earlier. Sam does a really good job of refuting them from their scriptures specifically. Another guy I watched when I first started researching the Jehovah's Witnesses is a guy named Mike Winger. Mike does a pretty good job of knowing their history and all the baggage that comes with the Watchtower and uses that as part of his argumentation against them. Lastly, Jeff Durbin over at Apologia Studios also does a pretty good job of witnessing to them. In particular, he has a lot of in-person confrontations on his channel, which I think is an invaluable resource to anyone who's learning how to deal with them in person. He also does a really good job of showing what it means to lead with love and empathy. He is very respectful and very cordial and leads with a lot of grace when talking to these people. There's also plenty of honorable mentions out there, such as God Logic Apologetics, Jay Dyer, and so on. But the people I mentioned earlier definitely have probably some of the most content when it comes to interacting with Jehovah's Witnesses. There's also a lot of XJW YouTube channels out there who are former members who either got excommunicated or left the religion as a whole. They're great resources for understanding what it means to be within the Watchtower and understand the mindset of someone who's within the cult's grasp. Lastly, I'll throw out the XJW Reddit thread. Now, definitely use discernment when reading through this, but I do think it's a good source for anecdotal experience, so you can kind of see what these people are thinking and doing, and in particular, actually getting to see what actually caused people to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I know I just threw a lot at you, but I promise that this is only an introduction. There's a lot that I did not cover in this video, so if you want to learn more about them, then please leave me a comment down below saying that you want more videos like this. But hopefully, until then, I hope this video gave you some sort of insight and information, helps you just kind of get your foot in the door when it comes to possibly converting them to the true faith. As always, if you have anything to add or want to discuss anything, please leave a comment down below, and also make sure to like, subscribe, and all of the other YouTube things to help support this channel. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.